Hello and welcome to Crime Scene the Screen, a Banterflix spin-off podcast where myself and my lovely sleuth sister Therese Highland go through the true stories behind true crime films. And this week we have a special treat for everyone as we are going to look at the life of Frank Abagnale Jr. through the 2002 Steven Spielberg film Catch Me If You Can, starring Leonardo DiCaprio and Tom Hanks. But before we get into anything, hello Therese.
Hello, Joseph. How are
How
you?
are you? I am good, thank you. And it's lovely to be back together again. So, I suppose before we get into the film, I suppose it's best we just play a wee clip from it. So, here is a clip from Catch Me If You Can.
Welcome to Miami Mutual Bank. How may I help you?
I'd like to cash this check here and I'd like to take you out for a steak dinner.
Are you a real life pilot?
I sure am, little lady.
The jump seat is open.
It's been a while since I've done this. Which one's the jump seat again?
Dr. Connors to the ER. Dr. Connors to the ER.
This is irrefutable evidence that the defendant is lying.
Special Agent Hanratty, FBI.
Hello, Carl.
You're gonna get caught. It's like Vegas. The house always wins. Some nuts flying around the country posing as a pilot. Call him the James Bond of the sky.
Hello, Pusher. This is by far the best date I have ever been on.
He's a kid. That's why he doesn't have a record.
30 milligrams of codeine every 4 hours. Do you concur?
I concur.
Dr. Harris,
Yes?
do you concur?
Concur with what, sir? Ma'am, I'm sorry to have to tell you, your son is forging checks.
I have a payroll check here I'd like to cash.
I'm working part-time at the church now. Just tell me how much yours and I'll pay you back.
$1.3 million.
I'll be choosing 8 young ladies to be a part of Pan Am's future stewardess program.
South America, Australia, Singapore. These are so perfect the bank doesn't even know the difference. What do you want?
To apologize.
You didn't call to apologize, did you? You have no one else to call. I'm looking for your son.
I would never give up my son. If you were a father, you'd know.
Stop chasing me.
I can't stop. It's my job.
First things first, what did you think of the film, Therese?
So I've always had a soft spot for this film. I mean, initially, I think I watched it quite like years ago, maybe when I was in my teens, and didn't really know. I think it was maybe like a film 4 movie on like a Friday or Saturday or something. Didn't really know much about the fact that it was based on a true story. You know, Leonardo in any film is due to be a winner, and the fact that Steven Spielberg was the director, from the outset, you would think that that this is an Oscar winner, or it's going to win a couple of awards. I think it's very fast paced. I don't want to say too much in terms of it is a good story, but in terms of the story in the sense of is it fact or fiction is another thing. We can come to that whenever we talk more about Frank himself and everything that went on. But I do think it's a nice watch. Some people that I've spoke to about, saying that we were going to do the recording of this had said that they found it actually quite long. There were certain bits that maybe could have been cut out, but actually when you look into the research of Frank, there was so much more that wasn't included in the movie that has been left out. So I think that they were able to cut what they could. It also has a great range of cast. We've got, as I say, Leonardo DiCaprio as Frank. We've got Christopher Walken as Frank Sr., his father. Martin Sheen's in it. Tom Hanks is in it. We've got Amy Adams and Amy Acker. Quite a good cast, and I suppose for the time, 2002, quite like a well-known enough cast, if you know what I mean, people kind of in their prime. But what are your thoughts initially on the film yourself?
Well, I love the film. Like I've seen it years and years ago. Like yourself, it was probably just something on Film 4 or BBC in around Christmas time, because they always tend to show it around Christmas or bank holiday or something. And I absolutely loved it. I was just sort of like bowled over by the world of that late 50s or early 60s America, like the likes of Pan Am taking off in terms of international air travel and all that there stuff, and how it isn't a Bond film, but it has the look and the sort of feel and vibe about that sort of exotic edge.
Like lavish, and I suppose
Yes,
of
that's
a
the
certain of a certain age and time as well too.
Yes, that's what I mean. Like that aspect of it won me over, and then obviously when you get to the cast, that was just fantastic. Leonardo DiCaprio's brilliant. So is Tom Hanks, Christopher Walken, Amy Adams. Even the smaller roles, like Jennifer Garner's only in it for one scene, and Martin Sheen's great in his small but sort of crucial role as well. But even Spielberg, like I was watching a bit of the behind the scenes stuff with this here, and you're talking about it being fast paced. They shot it at a fast pace as well. So it was a case of like, oh, it reminded me when I was doing television, and like Spielberg's known for being like the first director of Columbo, sort of set the bar with that there and what it looked like and all that stuff. But with this here, you can tell it's done at a breakneck pace, and by doing that, it sort of forced him to be a bit more creative with his shots and that there. So like you look at certain things, you're like, there's the Spielberg magic, there's this, that, and the other. But the thing that really won me over this time watching it was John Williams' score. It's not really his typical score, it's sort of a bit more jazzy in that there, but I like it. You see in the opening credits how it comes into play, and the difference between the theme for the FBI and then Frank's theme in and of itself, how they sort of clash together and all that. So I absolutely love that aspect of things. So I sort of view it as one of his more underrated films. That's just my thoughts on it initially.
Did you feel the more you've watched it, the more you've grown to love it?
Yeah. No, I think that's a fair thing to say. But the other aspect of it watching it this time was having read the book. It's called Catch Me You Can, The True Story of a Real Fake. It's written by Frank Abagnale alongside Stan Redding. The way that book paints Frank is completely different than the film, I find. I think the film's a lot kinder to him. Like, even though the book itself is from his perspective, I don't like him as a character in the book as much.
It's more kinder, and I think it glamorizes him quite a bit.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's maybe down to the fact that it was Leonardo DiCaprio that was cast to play him. The 2002 again hype and height of Leo and his heartthrob sort of run through. I don't think he was long after shooting The Beach after this film. So, and even Romeo and Juliet. So he kind of took in the female eye, and I suppose even in the film, and we'll get into it in terms of the scams and things, it's much more believable to me in the film that women particularly would have been swept up in his fantasy, and believing that he actually was a pilot, and yes, he actually was a doctor, and yes, he actually worked for a bank and was a teacher and things, probably because he was it was Leonardo DiCaprio playing him. If you look at some real videos and interviews, like there's one with Johnny Carson. He's not that much of a looker. Like, I don't know if that's really my difference in, I wasn't around in the 50s. I might have found it attractive then. I don't know. But yeah, the film does seem to glamorize it a lot more, and I don't know if that is down to the cast. And I feel like you root for him a wee bit better in the film, whereas I would agree with you. I haven't read the book, but I've watched quite a few interviews with him, and particularly as he's older in his life. He had done a couple of talks with Google and things, and he just seems quite arrogant and very unapologetic about what he did and things like that. But we can come back to that. But it's interesting for you to say that as a film, you enjoy it more as you watch it. Maybe not so much the story and the person that it's about, really. I might have picked that up wrong, but that's the sort of vibe I get off you, that you don't learn to love the person, you just learn to love the film for what it is itself.
Well, yeah, that's what I mean. It just goes back to my initial comments about how the world that's created, that's what sweeps you up more than anything. It's not that Frank's not a compelling character. I think he is, and his motivations in the film are different to what they actually were in real life. But we'll get into that, and I suppose that's a good point for us to sort of actually dive into it and dive into the film and Frank himself. So he was born on the 27th of April in 1948, and the first sort of major detail that sort of deviates away from the film is the fact that Frank had siblings. He had 2 brothers and a sister, but for me, I think the reasoning behind them cutting them from the film is to keep it more personal between his relationship between him and his father. Like, if you have brothers and sisters involved, then that sort of distracts it a bit more, because the whole idea of the film, and especially in the early parts of it in his early life, is this influence his father has, and it almost like he introduces him into how to con people in a way. There's a scene wherever he's going to pick up a suit for him, and he claims, oh, it's from his grandfather, his war hero, and all that there, and then he uses the necklace to get the lady who owns the store to open it up early for him. But that's not, and that's another difference as well. Frank's father wasn't really like that. He was just like a sort of normal, typical fella who just wanted to work hard for his family, but he'd had tax problems with the IRS, so then that's what led them to downsizing and stuff like that. He wasn't this sort of larger than life character in a way, talking about things about like two mice falling in a pot of cream and stuff like that. He doesn't, in the book, he doesn't come across as that sort of person, and even Frank himself admits, no, my father wasn't like that there. But again, it doesn't, for me, detract away from what the film was going for, which is basically, Frank did what he did because he wanted to try and use his acts of forgery and his con artist work as a means to try and somehow bring his parents back together again. I suppose you can go on into that end of things, the relationship between Frank's parents and what happened there, if you've anything there, Therese.
Yeah, so as you said, in real life, Frank was part of a bigger family, but in the film, it seems to portray quite a close bond, both with his father and his mother. There is a sort of romanticized view of the father and mother. The mother was French, and there's a scene essentially where his father, Frank Sr., who's played by Christopher Walken, says that he remembers whenever he first met his wife and they were at a dance and she was dancing with someone else, and it was during the war and everything's very romanticized and how she caught his heart, and here they are. And the scene in the film, they put a record on the record player and they start dancing, and Frank is almost just sitting there sort of, glazed over with admiration for both of his parents, and being swept up in that whole idea that everything's okay, when in reality, underneath it all, there was a lot more cracks than they were led to believe.
Yeah. But just on that scene before you go away, that's why I love that scene. It's the fact that it begins with the mother spilling the wine on the carpet, and instead of dealing with that problem, he's like, no, let's just dance. So it's basically like they have all these undercurrent issues, but they decide, no, we'll sort of not worry about it. We'll dance away.
They sort of pick and choose the time for them to worry about what's going on.
Yeah.
And I don't know if it's a case of whether they did that to put a face on for the son in the film, or to dress up the scene. I'm not too sure. But this then leads to there's underlying issues. His wife feels there's a huge strain on the relationship, particularly with the tax and the IRS issues. His father's trying to hide them all. He's going through an investigation, and all the while then the mother, who is played by Natalie Bay, she's having an affair with, they are part of a Rotary club, like a social club essentially, and she's having an affair with one of the chairmen, and Frank Jr. basically sees it all, and initially he is confused by it and sort of maybe takes his anger out on himself and kind of storms out. And his mother sort of reassures him that, it's a one-time thing. But then it continues on and more and more. And essentially then the parents file for divorce, which I suppose is similar enough as to what happened in real life. Frank's father moves away, they separate. And, I think this maybe like a start of a trigger of small larceny arrests that Frank has, all, as you say, though, to sort of, in a weird way, bring his family back together, mainly because I suppose the big trigger that what he feels has drove them apart was the fact that his father had money issues. And I would say part of that probably was the reason. I think maybe the other part of it was just the fact that they didn't love each other anymore. But it's a running theme throughout all of the scams that he makes and all the things that he does, is that he tries to humanize all of his crimes by saying that, I just wanted my parents and I just wanted my family back together. If you want to suppose and pick up kind of the next after that, whenever they separate and I suppose what I say in the film is like the start of the fun. Because they kind of make it out to be like, these escapades, as you said, like a James Bond adventure type movie, when in reality this fella's committing numerous crimes quite in quick succession as well.
Well, that thing, like we mentioned, the divorce, I think it happened in 1962, I'd have written down here. But then, unlike the film more or less goes, okay, parents got divorced, Frank ran away from home, that was it. Where in reality, he went to live with his father for a while, and it was living with his father, he gave him sort of a credit card to use at like a gas station. But a credit card for a gas station back then was like to help, if you want to buy parts for a car or stuff like that there. So that was sort of Frank's first con, in that he would use this credit card to buy sort of car related items. And when I say buy, it's like buy in inverted commas, because he would be like, oh, I'd like to buy these tires, I'd like to buy this, spoiler, whatever on the car. I don't think they had spoilers back then, but anyway. And through that there, he stole up to $3,400 because he kept asking for cash back on this card. So he kept running up the costs and that there. So that was the first thing. Whereas the film portrays it as, oh no, his first con was pretend to be a substitute teacher. So it's two very different things. Yeah. Like the substitute teachers, like you're alluding to earlier, it's an escapade. It's a bit of fun and that there. And the film portrays that the way. But I think the reasoning behind that was more to do with, okay, we have to show that this young 16-year-old, like, we have to show his confidence and all that there. It's a bit harder to do that if you're like, oh, I'd like cash back in this credit card. It's a lot easier to do. It's like, yes, I'm a commanding teacher in this classroom, going to start shouting bark orders and going to organize field trips and all that there. It comes across a lot better and visually if you do that in film rather than, I'm just going to get cash back in this here.
Again, it glamorizes what he did.
Yeah. Absolutely, yeah. I mean, it adds to the glamour, and that's sort of what Spielberg seems to be going for throughout the whole film, and we'll get into that, I suppose, in the next section. But I just want to take things a step back. So, in terms of Frank's father, what did you think of Christopher Walken in that role?
I mean, I love Christopher Walken. Totally off topic, but we've just finished a TV show called The Outlaws or The Outsiders. It's like different in America, on BBC, which was written by Stephen Merchant, and Christopher Walken was in it. And I just think he's a character in himself, and he can play a lot of different roles. He can play quite serious roles. He can play, comedy roles. Like, he's brilliant in Hairspray. He's brilliant in music videos. He's the Fatboy Slim music video. But in this, I think he again, not really knowing too much about Frank's father in real life. As you had mentioned, that he was quite a normal person. I hate to use normal for some people because it's almost like an offensive term, like they're boring or whatever. But I wouldn't have said he was as eccentric as Christopher Walken was in this. But I think he was the right person to play his father based on the direction they were taking. They were trying to show that Frank was swept up in his father's sort of ideas and ways around things, and there's definitely a jokey element to his character in this, but I think as you go progressively on through the film, it gets quite sad. He never really seems to, I suppose, make amends for his own problems, and throughout the film, I think any time, and it's no strange that Frank Jr. is arrested on multiple occasions, and often in time he ends up back in his father's car after this. There just doesn't seem to be any sort of what's the word I'm thinking of, discipline or repercussions for whenever Frank's let out again. He, in real life, he spent some time in the army, very, very short time, and he was discharged after 3 months. And then
this was Frank in the Navy, was it? As soon as he ran away from home?
Frank in the Navy. He was discharged after a couple of months. As soon as he was discharged, he then was arrested for multiple theft accusations and different things. And he always kept ending up back into his father's car. But there was just, and this is my opinion, there just never really seemed to be any sort of telling off essentially from his father, which meant that he kept doing it. And in the film, I think it portrays it quite well, is that his father almost like salutes him for like being smart about certain things, until I suppose toward the latter end, whenever the father realizes, I suppose, how much death and how much trouble that Frank has actually got him into. But I think he does well in portraying that everybody wants their parent, whether it's their mother, their father, their mother, father, and father, they want them to be adventurous and exciting and have stories and, pass all this on to you. So he in the film, I would say, probably never wanted to show his true side of being very upset about, the issues with the tax and losing his business and losing his wife. And he didn't probably want that to pass on to the son. So, even whenever the father remarried and things like that, they always kind of played it as if nothing was wrong and that nothing had ever been wrong, and things like that. Even his reaction to whenever he found out that his wife had been cheating, like he didn't really crack up, or it was all taken on the chin. Have you any other thoughts, or what's your idea on it?
No, I think that's just the nature of the character. He's just someone who's emotionally repressed and of his time in that respect. When you think about men back then, they weren't. It was almost frowned upon, like, oh no, you don't display your emotions. You are supposed to be the big strong man of the house. You're supposed to pass down these strong lessons to your children and all that there. But you can tell that it does break him. There's that scene where Frank meets him in the restaurant and he talks about, oh, I've got you a Cadillac, and he starts crying and breaking down a bit, but he sort of holds back at the same time, and it's bloody brilliant scene. I think that's Christopher Walken at his best, but I think it's just the summation of him as a person. He tries to hide it behind a bit of bravado and eccentricity, but at the same time, he can't help but let it seep out now and again because so much has gone against him. Like you mentioned, the IRS taxation issues, and then obviously his wife leaving him. But yeah, that I thought he was fantastic in the film, and he's someone who, when you look at the top tier casting between Leo and Tom Hanks, he's someone who can sort of easily get overlooked. But I suppose, you've mentioned the fact that he ran away from home to New York and then he got involved in small petty crimes then. I think it's a good opportunity now to move on to his major cons, starting with, as the film portrays, impersonating a pilot with Pan Am. So do you want to get into that end of things, Therese?
I'm muted there because in this day and age no one remains unmuted, but I was laughing away just thinking about the sort of quick succession of what happens.
But no, I'm just thinking as well. I thought you were laughing the fact, like, can you imagine going to like George Best International and just you could barely get in with like a bottle of like freaking shampoo or something. Never mind, like
we went to Manchester in March there, and had our boarding passes on our phones, and Ryan had accidentally scanned me in. Because he had them both on his phone and mine was the first one, so he had accidentally scanned his in, and I was like, well sure, I'll just scan you in, and that means we're both checked in. We got halfway through security and they stopped us, and they were like, you're not Ryan Highland and you're not Therese Highland, the two of us. We had to then go back out, get our tickets reprinted, even though we'd explained all this. So the fact that this fella literally walked up, bought a load of plastic, like small Pan Am airline things, made his own checks, forged his way through, convinced one of the chief executives that he was a pilot, and then ended up never flying a flight now, but always ended up somehow, thank God, but somehow always ended up as the sort of backup on the flight.
Yeah, he was in like the dead chairs, they call it. Basically, that whole thing is basically, when pilots are flying from place to place and they need someone to take over from a flight in another area, it's like, okay, you could be the dead chair, so you could fly to, say, Los Angeles, so then you can take over from someone who needs to fly from Los Angeles to somewhere else. So he did that a lot. I think he was in the book he mentioned he was a co-pilot at one point, but he was like, shit, what do I do? So he just put the plane on autopilot. Like, you just seen the autopilot button, it just flicked it. So can you imagine somebody actually doing that in your flight, even just going from here to Manchester? I know, mad. But
he had some balls. Had some big balls.
Well, that's the thing. He actually goes into just while we're sort of on that. He said, I was only able to do that because I was around 16. If I was 21, there's no way I could rationalize to myself how I'm able to pull off the things that I would have done. So basically, if he was 21, he would like, there's no way in hell I'm going to impersonate a pilot. There's no way in hell I'm going to be a pediatrician.
He still does a couple of things when he's in his 20s. So.
Oh yeah, but they're not as major as this here, because like these are sort of. But at the same time, you're like, you've some like neck in you. Yeah.
Well, literally, the first line I have here in my notes is, at 17, Abagnale decides that he's going to impersonate a pilot.
Yeah.
As I said, so in the film, they don't seem to really deviate too much, to be honest, from what actually happened. But in short, he forges a load of checks, basically, using plastic plastic versions of like souvenirs of a Pan Am airplane, and poses as a Pan Am pilot called Frank Taylor, and then basically uses those airline forged checks to go, and he goes to different banks in different cities that he flies to. Sorry, he doesn't actually fly the plane. He's on as a third pilot on the plane, processes as many of the checks as he can, which soon turns into forgeries worth millions and millions of dollars. He first turned up at a Manhattan airplane uniform store, and again, much like what his father had done whenever in his earlier days, turned on the charm, pretended it was this, pretended that he needed it. It was his first flight that he was going, and he had all these checks, and he basically gets the suit for free, and then is able to get multiple suits off this one shop for free. He fools a load of people, flies on multiple airlines, but makes sure never to be called forward for Pan Am, because they would know their own staffing essentially. But he would turn up to, I can't even think of say Delta. I don't even know if Delta was around then, but he would turn up to the Delta sort of check-in desk and say that Frank Taylor need to be in San Francisco for tomorrow, but there's no Pan Am flights going there at the minute. Can I head check off the back of your flight? He would end up in San Francisco, cash the check, meet one of the air stewardesses, and basically take them back to a motel. And he does this multiple times.
That was like his way of gathering information. So like if pilots asked him technical questions like, what equipment you're flying, basically like what kind of plane you fly and stuff like that, and how do I do certain things, get through the gates and all that there, they would, it was just, that was his bed talk, as it was. Just asking them, all this stuff.
And that was his ways, that he convinced his way in terms of his real life experiences. They were quite similar, as though they were how they were portrayed in the film. The only thing that would be different is in real life at this point in time, Frank was arrested. In the film, this is whenever we're introduced to Tom Hanks' character, who is Agent Carl Hanratty, who has been alerted basically to these forged checks. So he works for the FBI, but for the fraud department. And he gets a tip off from one of the checks being cashed, and he begins pursuing Frank basically. He eventually finds him at a motel where Frank tricks him into believing that he's a Secret Service agent called Barry Allen. So there again, another pseudonym, another alias that he's going under, and he escapes basically from Carl. Whereas in real life, he was arrested for the theft of checks in Tuckahoe, New York. He was sentenced to 3 years at the Great Meadow Prison in Comstock, New York, but he only served 2 years of his sentence when he was then released back into the custody of his mother this time. But he couldn't help himself, and he broke the terms of his parole after he stole a car in Boston, and then was returned to Great Meadow for another year. So, essentially he was sentenced for 3 years, but it was a span over of at least 4. So I think the film, what it tries to do is, and in my notes, and yours probably the same, he's arrested multiple times in real life for loads and loads of different things, but never really has quite a permanent time in jail. It's all two years here, a year here. And again, I'm not a police officer, so I don't know the law, but you would like to think in your mind that whenever someone has been arrested for multiple crimes, that the judge would look at the whole span and say, actually, this fellow needs to be put away for X amount of years, 20 to 30 years or whatever. Whereas in the film, Catch Me If You Can, that's the title of the film.
Yeah, it's Cat and Mouse.
It's the whole thing. It's him evading the escape the whole way through, right till the bitter end. But then I suppose at this point, he then decides to change his occupation. If you want to talk about our next lovely scam.
Yeah, no problem. But just going back to that briefly in the sort of last point you made about how he was arrested and how there were sort of gaps between things. I think obviously that was cut out of the film just to streamline it and for pacing. Like it's not a case of like, okay, he's a pilot, and then we're gonna have to see what he was like in jail for like 2 or 3 months or something like that. There, I think all of that stuff was just cut out. So then when you eventually get to the capture towards the very end, it's more definitive from a storytelling point of view rather than just making it more episodic in terms of he was a pilot, then he got arrested for this, then he got arrested for that, but then he went on to this scam and that scam and arrested. Although the film does do that to a degree, it seems more organic and its flow. And that sort of leads on to the next stage of the film, which isn't necessarily through the timeline of actual events, is when he posed as a pediatrician in a child's hospital in, I believe it was Georgia, was it? Or I think you've the right. Yeah, I'm right. It was in Georgia. And that's where he fell in love with, well, in the film, it's where he fell in love with Amy Adams' character, Brenda. So he falls for her and he's very sweet in her. Again, not like in real life. There was never really a Brenda character. There was a lady he was close to getting engaged with, but that was prior to this here. It was still when I think he was conning the likes of Pan Am and stuff like that there. It was Pauline Parks. He was sort of enamored with her, fell in love with her, but then one day he decided, yeah, I sort of want to still go on and do something else. So then that moment of realization when he left, he just realized, oh, I didn't actually like her that much. But then there's other interviews. People have went back based on the claims in the book about the whole Pauline Parks incident, and they went to Pauline herself, and she was like, I wasn't that hot in him either. He was never going to propose to me and stuff like that there. So again, that's going back to the book itself. It is his account. So it's very hard to get an understanding of going, well, who am I supposed to actually believe in this story? Obviously, there's a lot of fact within it, and the FBI's actually refuted a lot of his claims over the years as well. But going back to the film and this particular part, again, it's going back to the technical aspects of the film. That's the one thing Spielberg gets really spot on with the story, is that he's really sort of tied into this here, like going back to the checks, the manner in which he created them. It's sort of on the money, but when
He's
this
very
case,
meticulous in what he does.
that's the word, meticulous. Yeah. Oh, you're freaking made the source tonight. Love it. But yeah. So there's the particular scene. There's like a young child that's broken his leg or really badly cut his leg, and he's called to the emergency room, and he's like, I don't know what I'm doing with this, and he's very squeamish around blood as well. So he basically goes to the junior doctors, and it's like, I'm sort of you give me your opinion on this. What do you think we should do? And then there's the funny bit. It's like, do this, that, and the other. He's like, oh, I concur. Do you concur? And all that there, based on him watching this stuff on medical TV shows. But he actually did that. And that's how he was, sort of influenced. He would watch these things. Because that's, like at this stage, and even prior to that as a pilot, he was just a sponge for information. He would just soak in everything he could and just relay it on. This section, I like it. It's just a nice sort of breather after sort of a moment where he nearly got caught by Hanratty, who in real life, the name of that agent wasn't Carl Hanratty, it was Joseph Shea. He just didn't want his actual name used in the film. But yeah, I really liked that scene. And then eventually when he meets Brenda's parents, the lawyer played by Martin Sheen, I can't remember the character's name, and his wife, and they're Lutherans, and then he's to pretend, oh yeah, I'm a Lutheran too, and all that there stuff, and he sort of charms them and enamors himself to them as well, and that's where you can see that aspect of Frank and his personality sort of really shine through with Leo's performance, and that they are sort of gullible to it and they just buy it straight away, and then that leads him to practicing law, and this was in Louisiana at this point, I believe. In real life, it was Louisiana. I think it was maybe the same location in the film. And here he had to take the bar because he claimed, oh yeah, I went to Harvard. It wasn't the same university as the mentioned film. I went to Harvard. He tried to big himself up big time. And they're like, well, if you want to do that, you're going to have to take the bar. And he's like, oh no, because he's a fella that didn't even complete high school, never mind law school. But the thing is, in the book, this is what he claims now. Oh, it took me 4 times to do it, and I just passed it in the 4th time. Now, I'm sorry. I can barely pass, work tests. You have to do like your annual data protection.
An aptitude test.
I know.
Or even those tests of, are you a robot?
Oh, I know.
You have to,
where's the traffic lights?
Where's the traffic light?
Everywhere.
Which one's a motorcycle? Like,
you put the 11 plus in front of me. I'm failing that.
I barely passed it way back when, so it's not happening now.
Exactly.
In fact, he just went, oh sure. It's just, it's like a wee simple exam, like the bar that, takes people years upon years upon years.
Oh, yeah, it's like 7 years, I think, at least. I think it's at least 7 years. But that becomes a joke in the film, the fact that, in the film, Carl constantly asks him, how did you pass the bar? And there's the bit in the airplane where it's like, if you give me your Claire or half your Claire, I'll tell you. And then he just stuffs it in his mouth. He's like, no, I'm not giving you satisfaction. But anyway, what did you think of this section then, in terms of his relationship with Brenda and his family, and then being in the world of pediatrics and law?
I think in this, and maybe it's the same with, his time spent as a pilot. Like he definitely got you know, the jobs that he was impersonating, they were like highly thought of jobs, like a pilot, and then you're a doctor, and then you're a lawyer. As you were saying, that these are the types of jobs and occupations that take people years upon years of hard work, graft, study. At the time specifically, a lot of people maybe just didn't even finish school or high school or graduate or anything. A lot of them were just, leaving and say having families quite young or going and taking other jobs.
Yeah.
So I would say there's definitely like an element of power there that they were trying to portray. But again, it comes back to this sort of adventure. Oh, Frank, wake up. Who do you want to be today? Oh, well, I'm going to be a doctor and I'm going to pretend to do this and have these nurses fawn over me. And, being brought into a family where the husband and wife both love each other and they love their children and they'll do anything for them. And, I think just, in the film, it just showed just how being in the center of attention, he thrived on that. And he thrived in just being able to get away with things. And, as you say, pretending to help out with surgeries and consult people and things like that. And in the film, it makes it fun and it makes it entertainment. But when you actually get down to the nitty gritty of the real life consequences of it, it's quite sick in a way.
Yeah.
Coming back to the book and, different claims that have been refuted years later. This was something I suppose that he did both when he was a pilot, but also when he was a doctor. He claimed that he used to perform these like examinations on women as part of a training program. So he started off essentially doing this whenever he was a pilot, and that he would examine the stewardesses before they would be coming on, and he would claim that it was essentially
like a training program for
it was
them,
a training program, and because he was a pilot and a doctor, he was able to actually do that, do these specific, basically, without sugarcoating it, filling them up and, to his advantage in the sense that, sexually assaulting them, really, touching them inappropriately, leading to false pretenses. And a lot of these women believed that, this was actually part of the program. And he claimed that it was a fictional program and that he conducted physical exams on several colleagues who wanted to be part of flight crews. So he used to go out to these colleges and claim that he was the doctor and the pilot who actually chose women to join the crews. And it was part of this that he had to basically examine them, or quotes. But none of these women were ever enrolled in any sort of program or made stewardesses or anything like that. And it was much in the same of whenever he went to work as a doctor as well. He tried to do the same thing with nurses. So people who wanted to become nurses and join, he used to give these exams on students and claim that he could make, this was their ticket to basically become a nurse. So a quote here essentially from Robert Mann, who was a journalist who basically looked into a lot of his claims later in his years. And he had written some books and things about Abagnale and had some, lectures and stuff about him. After it came out, he basically said, looking back at my story about the event, I'm embarrassed by what I wrote about Abagnale's time posing as a pediatrician. Reading those words now in which Abagnale bragged about sexual abuse makes me sick. And this is in his book and in his lectures whenever he is in college. So what I think at this stage, what my criticism of the film would be is that they tend to ignore the gruesome truth of it and come back to sort of glamorizing and maybe scathing over a lot of the truly horrible things that he did. Imagine finding out years later as a child, maybe he was in that hospital, that you were shamed by a doctor about someone who was posing as a doctor, and the repercussions that could come off the back of that. So it's quite seedy in a way. I don't know what your thoughts are.
No, I think you're 100% on the money, because that's what I was telling you. Even like I remember messaging you as I was reading the book. I was like, he comes across as a bit of a creep, to be perfectly honest with you. Like this book itself, I think it was written in the early 2000s, like it was literally just before the films itself had a script and went into production. And even reading it, every other page, it's like him going, oh, and there were girls here and this, that, and the other. And he was like, oh, it almost paints a picture of like, oh, I did all this for women and stuff like that there, which to a degree he probably did. For
Yeah,
his
but
own
not for
reasons.
them, but for
Oh,
his
yeah.
own benefit.
Oh,
Yeah, not for
absolutely.
them.
Yeah. Just to make that abundantly clear. Yeah, it was for his own benefit, not a
Yeah.
case of like, oh, I can give you the high life and all that. There's like, he didn't give a damn about that, what he could do for other people. It was all about what he could do for him. It was like a childish attitude that never left him in a way, and it could never be. I don't mean to blame his parents, but like it couldn't be straightened out by them. Like they couldn't control him. He was that rebellious in that sense. But at the same time, comparing the real life to the film, the perfect example you brought up was when he chose all those young women to be air hostesses. In the film, it's like, oh, I'm going to pick all the pretty girls, and it's just a bit of chauvinism in line with that time. Whereas in reality, Spielberg doesn't mention at all about the fact that he felt up all these women and did all this, that, and the other. So I'm wondering if someone who wanted to do a bit of a darker take on the story would get into that a bit more, just to show, well, this is what a con man actually is, and this is what he actually does. Or were they so enamored with Abagnale as a person, be it on the set as a consultant, or even going back to, you mentioned the Johnny Carson interview, because when you watch that, you're like, oh, he comes across as affable and a bit charming and that there.
And interesting and exciting,
yeah.
and yeah.
If you didn't read the book, or if you don't look at it with a modern lens, because that interview itself, it was like back late 70s, early 80s, the Johnny Carson thing. But yeah, that was looking back, and when you actually realize the ramifications of what he'd done, it's absolutely wild. Because just going back to, again, there was a quote here from the book itself, where he bigs himself up as a con artist, and just, I think it's kind of the summation of how he thought of himself and the sort of pride he took in himself. I'll just read it out here. So he said, the former police chief of Houston once said of me, Frank Abagnale could write a check on toilet paper drawn on the Confederate States Treasury, sign it, "You are hooked," and cash it at any bank in town using Hong Kong driver's license for identification. So he's like, in that sense, he's saying, I could do whatever I want and people would just believe me. And to a degree, there is gullibility with people then, but that's more to do with the fact that, when you think about the process of checks and stuff like that there, it was a relatively new process then when you think about it in terms of like a mainstream use of it. So people are liable to believe someone. And what does come across, even in the writing and everything, is that Frank is a very overconfident person. And that sort of shines through as well in the film. So that's why people are like, not to comment on his looks or anything like that, but, you see pictures of Frank even then, you're like, you sort of look like a bog standard sort of a fella. How do you think you could have all these women and that there? It's more to do with the fact he's just a very confident person, and that comes up in that respect. But sort of moving on then, like we've brought up that aspect of, his, the training program he done. So I think if we move on towards the end then, when he got captured by French authorities, I believe it was in Montpellier in France. So yeah, do you want to take it away from there?
Yeah, so again, going by the film, essentially, at this stage of the film, Frank is engaged to Brenda, seems to be somewhat settling down, and he is due to attend essentially their engagement party one night, kind of has a second thought and escapes out through their bedroom window, telling Brenda to meet him at the Miami International Airport 2 days later. So, whether it's a case of that he didn't want to go through with the wedding, or he just felt that he had to continuously be on the run, but bring Brenda along with him, I don't know if we'll ever really know that.
Oh, was it not a case Carl was at the party? Because he found out...
sorry, that's right.
Yeah, because he seen something to do with the engagement party being announced in the papers, because he couldn't use a different name at that stage. So he's like, look for engagements relating to, I think it was Connors was a surname.
Sorry, that's right.
Yeah. But I think you're right in what you're saying. I think there was a degree of cold feet in him, because he did have that sort of lust for the high life still. So I don't think it would ever have lasted with Brenda in the context of him. And then it sort of harkens back to the whole Pauline Parks thing. He didn't seem fussed on her, even though in real life she wasn't fussing him either, it turns out. But
And
Yeah,
maybe
so
even speaks volumes a lot about just the relationship his mother and father had too. You know, maybe just afraid to commit. But sorry, you're yes. Carl turns up at this engagement party
yeah,
and he panics and escapes through a window and says, "You Brenda, meet me here, X, Y, and Z." All the while, Carl then, you know, sort of in the background is speaking to the Connors family. Sorry, not Connors, to Martin Sheen's character's family. That his name's Roger Strong, and telling them all about Frank. And essentially, they convince Brenda to entrap him, really. So she turns up at an airport with plainclothes agents, and he realizes that it's basically she's given him up, and he decides to not go into the airport and just drives away. He then basically falls back into the piloting, his piloting alias, and escapes, basically surrounded by 8 women as stewardesses, and boards a flight to Madrid. So in 1969, according to the film, in the film it's Mont Richard, but in real life it's Montpellier. Essentially, is where he gets arrested. Carl tracks him down to his fictional mother's hometown, convinces him to finally surrender. He's holed up essentially in a French prison, and Carl then turns up to extradite him back to the US. So we didn't really talk about it much, but this is essentially where the film begins. So you see, it's kind of like in retrospect, flashback. The film kind of opens basically with Frank in this prison, and then goes back to tell the story. So while we've already discussed this, in the film it may seem that this is the first time he's been arrested, when in reality he was arrested on multiple occasions. He was again extradited back from Montpellier to the US to basically be able to serve his term, where ironically he ended up working with the FBI.
yeah, it's just like the film.
Just like the film. They essentially, I suppose, again, expertise, which are in air quotes here, and the FBI, you know, reach out to him and basically talk about other fraud cases. And he, while in jail, kind of barters with them to say, you know, I'll ask for like a reduced sentence or do this, do that if I was to help you with certain crimes. Much in the same of in the film, he's extradited back to the US with Carl. And you know, he basically visits him regularly in prison, and during one he shows him a fraud check from a case that he's working on, and he's able to tell him straight off that a bank clerk essentially was involved. And there then begins Frank working for the FBI after all that, which I don't know, again, in the film, I don't know if this adds to his whole, you know, glamorizing his whole life. That yes, things have become full circle. He's finally been arrested. He's, you know, was on the US most wanted list for X amount of years, but he's now working for the people and working for the man who's been tracking him down. You know, is that the perfect ending? He's still almost being that adventurous person because, you know, he's adding another occupation to his long list. He's now an FBI agent. The ending, I don't know where it really sits with me in the film. In real life, yeah, he does serve quite a long time. He does work with the FBI, but again, maybe the film ends on a more lighter note, you know, painting him in a certain way. Whereas whenever you read what happens to him, you know, as he goes on in life, he becomes somewhat of a celebrity. What's your take on the ending? Do you agree that it was set up the right way, or does it sort of take a turn on the whole film itself?
I don't really see it the same way you do, to be honest, because, right, we'll go back to the sort of chain of events. So he's arrested and imprisoned in France, and then he's extradited back to the United States. I forgot to mention, in that process as well, he finds out that his father died. Although his escape is different in real life, he escaped through like the kitchen part of the plane, you know, where they have the hot meals and they like wheel them up and down.
Yes.
He got away that way, not through the toilet. But then yeah, eventually when he's captured again and he's sent to prison, I think it's for 5 years in real life he served. But what the film doesn't mention, it's not a straight sort of move. Okay, prison, then FBI. He did actually go into the real world as it was, and he worked small jobs. He worked as a grocer and stuff like that there. But he tried to use his con methods to try and have not mentioned the fact, like, yeah, I'm an ex-convict for this, that, and the other reason. You know, he sort of left that out of every sort of application.
He hid his crimes.
Yes, yeah.
He didn't declare them and things. Yeah.
Absolutely, yeah. And then, yeah, he eventually works for the FBI. So those scenes where he is back working with the FBI, I think that is his punishment for him. For him, not, you know, we may not view as a punishment when you think about when you actually stop to think about what he actually done, in terms of he gave wrong treatments to children in a hospital. God knows what he could have done as a lawyer, in terms of who he could have got off a crime or who he could have incriminated that was perfectly innocent, but because mistrials, whatever, or even as a pilot, because they could have asked him, like I mentioned the real life story, anytime it's like, oh, I need you to take over as co-pilot for a bit while, say, I used the toilet or whatever. God knows what could have happened in that situation when you actually stop to think about it. But in reality, the fact is, like, yeah, you're going to be sitting in this room looking at these fake checks, seeing what's wrong with them and letting us know what's wrong with them. That's when everything comes crashing down. I think the real life story is a bit more positive in the fact that he set up his own consultancy firm, Abagnale and Association, I think it's called, shortly after working for the FBI. I think it was in the early 2000s that he started it, or it could have been a bit sooner. And then you've alluded to at the start of this here podcast, the fact that he's done TED Talks, he's talked to Google, all these tech firms about fraud and counterfeit and stuff like that. And I was even reading an interview, like, in the digital age, what would you do? And he was saying more or less about the fact, like, oh, well, during my sort of reign as, the top con artist in the world, I stole 2.5 million. I'd aim bigger. Now, I would go for 20 million. I go for 30 million. And he's not even talking about the fact of inflation. It's like, oh, identity theft's so easy to do, so I would, engage in that there. And identity theft's one of the most horrible, sort of, fraudulent crimes you can do. So the fact that, going back,
that he's making light of it again. Yeah,
he doesn't really care. No,
yeah.
Absolutely not. So that just sort of paints that aspect of things. So I think we're sort of, towards the end of wrapping up things, but I never got asking you, what did you think of Tom Hanks's performance in Leo's, and then sort of the dynamic between the two of them? Because we didn't really get into their performances as much. We just sort of mentioned about what they did on screen more than anything.
Looking back on the whole thing, they're good counterparts in that whole camp. I say, Itchy and Scratchy, Tom and Jerry, Carry On. There's like an element of envy between the two of them, jealousy between the two of them. Tom Hanks plays Carl Hanratty, is a very by the book guy, a job's worth. Someone, he works in the fraud department. He's not like a crime detective or part of the behavioral analysis unit. Do you know what I mean? And again, that's not putting down the fraud agency or anything like that. Those jobs are clearly very important. But when you think of the FBI, you don't think of a fraud investigator straight away. So the way he throws himself into the investigation and becomes the lead investigator on it, and it's almost played like Tom Hanks's character's having his own adventure, because he's on this chase and on this run with Leo, and the way that their relationship is, it's almost like they enjoy each other as well. Whenever he's captured in the film, when he goes to the prison in France, I don't really get the sense that there's much animosity between the two of them.
I think there's almost like a paternal.
It's very much like, you finally got me.
Yeah. But I almost feel like at that stage he's sort of become a father figure in a way to him, in the strangest of ways, and that I've caught you now, but I kind of care about you at the same time, because whenever he was on the run, although he was teasing him through the phone calls, it's like, well, you're only calling me because you've no one else to call. So I think there was a degree of pity.
Phoning him on Christmas Day and different things like that.
And then the fact that he realizes, well, I'm calling you Christmas Day and you're not with your family. And he's like, well, yeah, I've sort of separated from my family. I think that's, in a way, he saw parallels between his father in him, in a way, and like his father in Hanratty as a character. And then that's what eventually leads to their friendship, as it alludes to, in the blurb at the end of the film, that they're still friends to this day. So that's the aspect of it that I got watching it this time. Like, I think I was like yourself the first time I watched it. It was like, they're sort of big cutthroat for themselves. It's like, yeah, oh, you're going to have to catch me and all this here stuff. But this time, that's when the sort of paternal end of things sort of came more to the fore for me watching it. But I thought they were both great in that aspect of things, and their chemistry in that aspect worked really well on screen.
Leo was like a standalone as Frank. After watching interviews of him, I feel like there's more of like a childlike element of the way Leo portrays him. I don't really get the same element of arrogance, and I don't want to say he is very self-assured, obviously, and the confidence oozes out of him. But in particularly in the talks that he had with Google, as what you had mentioned, I would steal more money, type of thing like that. I get more of the sense of a lost little boy in the film, and someone who's always seeking validation, and through his crimes, that's what it's resulted in, is that he keeps putting it back to, he just wants to get his family back together. Whereas seeing a couple of interviews of him in real life, he's a bit of a dick. Like,
Yeah.
He doesn't really say much of what he's done wrong, or admit that what he had done wrong, or as we were talking before we had started recording, it said in the book that he didn't actually physically hurt anybody, but he did. Like, those examinations, and I'm sure if kids were coming in, he had to examine them, or maybe not even physical hurt, but like mentally, if he had been involved in, as you say, in any cases, law cases and things like that. For me, Tom Hanks played that sort of sleuthy typed FBI character quite well. Leo played a more tame, childlike version of Frank Abagnale, whereas in comparison to what I've seen in interviews for him, so I wouldn't really say the accuracy's there, but that was maybe my opinion maybe changed after watching the interviews of real life Frank. I think maybe before, whenever I'd first watched it, I would have thought, oh, this guy's just a character, this guy's just adventurous and exciting, and maybe that's truly who he was. But I suppose as we come into the close altogether, we also can't really bypass the fact of the question, Joe, that do you believe a lot of what this man said? The FBI, and even though he's written the book and there's the film, and but the FBI and a lot of people came out later in life and kind of contested everything he said, and was like, no, a lot of this was fabricated, a lot of this was lies, and there's even certain things that Frank himself admitted to say, actually, that didn't really happen. But what are your thoughts?
Well, I think this is a good opportunity for me to put in this interview clip that I found about Frank. He was doing an interview with 60 Minutes in Australia, and it sort of sums up what he thinks of himself and what he thinks of his crimes. This is a clip from that interview.
Even when I was doing the things that I did, I paid back $2 million of that money because I hadn't spent it. And then I eventually paid the other $500,000 back only because I felt it was right to pay all the money back. But as a kid, I couldn't spend $2 million. So it was never really the money. It was more of just going on the adventure and doing it and seeing how much you could get away with. I would just add that when I did all the things I did, one of the things that I realized very quickly later on is that all the people I met that I really never did anything to, in fact, I took them places, I spent money on them, I bought them lots of things, they were the people most upset with me because those people felt deceived, that I thought you were my friend, and yet you weren't who you say you would. You didn't trust me enough to tell me who you really were. So it's kind of like the people who say, the guys got into my house, but they didn't steal anything, but they went through all my belongings. That bothers them more than if they had stolen something. And I had to come and realize that with maturity, that's very devastating to people.
Okay, so that was Frank in his own words. And then just sort of going back to what you were saying there, yeah, even reading the book, you're like, I know it's a larger than life story, but a lot of this is embellished, and a lot of it is, what, I don't think it was too self-critical. I think that's my problem with the book and the story. He always sort of paints himself in a positive light, mostly in a positive manner, and there's no room for criticism. Whereas the film, there is that sense of it, and there is a sense of him realizing, I'm sort of really, it's a lonely life, this life as a con artist, going back to the calls he would make with Carl. And I think that sort of stems more from Spielberg than Frank, if that makes sense. Because when you think of Spielberg, he's always known as the sort of emotional sort of divorce director, if you know what I mean. In terms of a lot of his films deal with the idea of divorce and stuff like that. Even more fantastical stuff like E.T. and that there. But here he almost puts more of himself into Frank than Frank himself is in it, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
In terms of how a young person copes with divorce and instead of in the film, obviously he turns to crime, but I think it's Spielberg's analogy of like, well, Frank turned to crime, I turned to filmmaking to try and cope with this. And that comes across even when you look at his latest film, The Fabelmans. But back to Catch Me If You Can and the story of Frank Abagnale. I wouldn't like to meet someone like Frank Abagnale in real life, to be perfectly honest with you, after having read the book and watch the series of interviews around him. I would like to meet the Frank in the film, though, if
I
that
would
makes
agree
sense.
with you there, yeah.
So I suppose just sort of final ratings before we fully wrap up. What do you rate this sort of film out of 5 then?
I would give it 3.5 out of 5. It's still a great film. For me, I would agree with you in a sense that the more I've watched it, the more that I've learned to appreciate it. But I maybe wouldn't go out of my way to say I really wouldn't seek it out. Like if it was on, Film 4 again or ITV. It does tend to be on ITV quite a bit, as you say, around Christmas time. I would stick it on and see, follow the tail end of it. I wouldn't put it back to the start or go openly looking to watch it again. I think definitely if you've never seen it and you're listening to this episode, well, we've virtually spoiled quite a bit.
That's the point of this pod. We have to get into the story.
Yeah, but if you haven't seen it, or if you haven't seen it in years, definitely go back and give it a watch. It is definitely, I would agree, one of the more underrated Spielberg films. It isn't up there with E.T. or things like that, but it's still very good. But I think maybe after looking into this research and just kind of seeing the truth behind Frank, it's maybe put me off it slightly. But what would your rating be out of 5?
For me, it's close to a 5. I think it's a 4.5 out of 5. But that's because, and that's even having read the book, because I finished the book and then I watched the film, because I sort of more viewed it from, it's like, okay, from what I remember before reading the book about the film, because I'd seen it before reading the book, I wonder how it's going to change my view on watching it this time. And I still absolutely loved it. Again, I think it was more of a nostalgic feel, like, oh, I'm back to when I first seen this. I'm swept up in this world.
Mm-hmm.
I love this sort of story, the cat and mouse nature of it. The fact that you get that from the score and everything there. It almost sort of pushes you away from Frank and brings in Spielberg. It's going back to my previous point. It's like I get more Spielberg than I get of Frank Abagnale in this film. So that's why I think it's one of Spielberg's most underrated films in that respect. And I really, really love it. Anytime it's on around Christmas, no matter what part of the film you're in, he could just start being a lawyer. You're like, right, I'm locked in until the rest of this things runs its course. If there's about an hour left, don't care, I'm going to watch the rest of this. Or it could even be early on, just, when his parents are dancing in the living room. You're like, no, I love this film. I'm going to watch it all now. If you haven't seen it, seek it out. It's a wonderful, wonderful film. I love it a lot. It is, compared to the real life story, it has its edges sort of pared down, but that doesn't diminish how great it is for me. So again, 4.5 out of 5. Really, really like this film.
With that, Joe, then that's another episode of Crime Scene to Screen over. Again, if you'd enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to Banterflix's main stream. This should be getting released fairly shortly. Normally aim to release on a Monday, but at present, it's whenever we can get a chance to get it out. Again, we'll continue with the format of maybe picking those lighthearted films. I suppose, how lighthearted can you be with true crime? But maybe we'll look to do something based on a TV show next. That's all from me. So thanks very much for giving us a listen.
Yes, and thank you very much, Therese, for all your hard work and your research into these horrible, horrible people.
And likewise, I mean, it's the only way we pass our time, Joe.
Absolutely.
If you want to follow Banterflix on all the socials, we are on Instagram, Facebook, X, and YouTube as well. And you can also find the feed for the main Pixels on a Screen podcast, which is there. And we should also shortly be having a Disney spin-off podcast make a return. But that's all from us tonight. So goodbye.
Bye.